The boarding school waken weet always those bells ringing, footsteps in neat house, porridge steaming on the high ceiling, but the meeting is warm before Anione das to say dat loot. Three beds at ontoord, shits dicht, pillows mode, is es a night forgo to use them. Whole call begins, namens read with practice calm, and die zielengse lands have retan the last. T achers keep tire voice even. Plates keep clinking. Otine keeps moving, I must stoop Bernie, as if ordekin as if as the three gears are simply gona. No screams, no broken locks, no trail, just absence, clean, quiet, and impossible to explain.
The night did not announce itself as important. There was no storm, no sudden cut of electricity, no dramatic interruption to routine. It arrived the way all nights did at the boarding school, quietly, obediently, following the bell that marked the end of study hour. The building exhaled into darkness, its long stone corridors settling into their familiar hush. Lamps were dimmed, doors were closed, slippers replaced shoes. Somewhere, a clock began its slow negotiation with time, ticking with the confidence of something that believed tomorrow would arrive unchanged. From the outside, the school looked like it always had in late autumn. Ivy clung stubbornly to its walls, leaves brown and curling at the edges. The windows glowed faintly, each one a small square of life held inside stone. It was a place built to endure. Thick walls, narrow staircases, history embedded in every surface. For generations, children had been sent here to be shaped into something respectable. Discipline was a language spoken fluently within these halls. Silence, its most trusted companion. Inside the dormitory, the girls prepared for sleep the way they had been taught. Beds were made with precision, corners tucked tight. Personal items were arranged neatly, never spilling into disorder. Letters from home were folded and hidden away. Diaries were slipped beneath pillows or into locked drawers. The last whispers faded as the lights went out, and one by one, the girls disappeared into the vulnerable anonymity of sleep. No one heard footsteps leaving the dormitory that night. No door slammed. No alarm sounded. The rules of the school were rigid, and breaking them carried consequences severe enough to discourage even curiosity. Students did not wander after hours. Teachers did not patrol unless scheduled. Silence was assumed to mean compliance. It wasn't until morning that something felt wrong, and even then, it arrived disguised as routine. The wake-up bell rang, sharp and insistent, slicing through the remnants of dreams. Girls stirred, groaned, sat up in their beds. The dormitory came alive in the familiar, half-awake rhythm of another school day. Blankets were thrown back. Feet touched cold floors. Someone laughed quietly at a joke barely formed. Then someone noticed a bed that hadn't been slept in. At first, it was dismissed. Perhaps she was already in the washroom. Perhaps she had been called away early by a teacher. The school trained its students not to assume disorder. Questions were postponed. Doubt was impolite. But then another bed drew attention. Sheets untouched, pillows smooth, and then a third. 3 empty beds, a line along the same wall, as if absence itself had been arranged with care. The room grew still in a way that felt different from the silence of night. This was not disciplined quiet. This was hesitation. The girls looked at one another, searching for reassurance in familiar faces, but finding only confusion reflected back at them. Someone whispered a name. Someone else shook her head. A prefect was summoned. The prefect did what she was trained to do. She straightened her posture, scanned the room, and told everyone to continue getting ready. There would be an explanation. There always was. Roll call was held in the dining hall, as it always was. Long tables, polished smooth by decades of elbows and hands, stretched beneath the high ceiling. The smell of porridge hung in the air. Cutlery clinked softly. Names were read aloud, voices steady, practiced. When the first name went unanswered, the pause was brief. A clerical error. Perhaps, when the second was met with the same silence, a few heads turned. By the third, the pause stretched long enough to become noticeable. The headmistress stood at the front of the hall, her hands folded neatly in front of her. She did not panic. She did not raise her voice. She simply stopped speaking, her gaze fixed on the list she held, as though the paper itself had betrayed her. For a moment, the entire room seemed to hold its breath. Then she cleared her throat and moved on. Breakfast continued. The decision not to disrupt the routine was made quickly and without discussion. This was a place where order was synonymous with safety, where the appearance of control mattered more than the truth unfolding beneath it. Teachers exchanged glances but said nothing. Students whispered but were silenced with a look. Plates were cleared. Chairs scraped softly against the floor. Somewhere in the building, the 3 empty beds remained untouched. As the morning progressed, the absence became harder to ignore. Teachers noticed the missing faces in class. Attendance sheets were marked with faint, hesitant lines. Notes were sent between offices, carried by students instructed not to ask questions. The school's internal machinery began to turn, slow and cautious, as if afraid that moving too quickly might make the problem real. By midday, the local authorities were notified, not urgently, not dramatically. The call was measured, professional, stripped of emotion. 3 students were unaccounted for. No signs of forced departure. No witnesses. Just absence. When the police arrived, they did not bring chaos with them. They walked through the gates calmly, their presence almost subdued, as though matching the tone set by the institution itself. They were shown the dormitory, the empty beds, the lockers still neatly arranged. Nothing appeared disturbed. Nothing suggested a struggle. It was as if the girls had simply dissolved into the air. Questions were asked, but carefully. Had anyone noticed unusual behavior? Had there been talk of running away? Any conflicts? Any signs of distress? The answers came back orderly and unsatisfying. No, not really. Nothing worth noting. That night, as the sun set and the lamps were lit once more, the school returned to silence. But it was no longer the same silence that had existed the night before. This one carried weight. It pressed against the walls, seeped into corners, settled into the spaces where the girls should have been. Some students lay awake in their beds, staring at the ceiling, replaying the day in fragments. Others cried quietly, muffling their sobs into pillows. A few convinced themselves that by morning, everything would make sense, that the girls would return embarrassed and apologetic, and the world would snap back into place. But deep within the building, something had shifted. The clocks kept ticking. The bells rang when they were supposed to. Lessons were taught. Meals were served. But an unspoken understanding had taken root. The school had learned how to swallow 3 lives without choking. And in doing so, it taught everyone inside its walls a lesson far more enduring than anything written in its curriculum. That disappearance does not always arrive with violence, that horror can be quiet, and that the most frightening things often happen without anyone raising their voice at all. Before they were missing, before their names became careful pauses in conversation, the girls existed in small, ordinary ways that felt unremarkable at the time. That ordinariness was what made remembering them so painful later. They were not legends or warnings or mysteries yet. They were students, bound by routine, shaped by adolescence, carrying private universes behind composed faces. One of them had a laugh that came too quickly, as if it had been waiting just beneath the surface for any excuse to escape. Teachers described her as disruptive, though her friends knew she was simply restless. She tapped her fingers against desks, chewed the ends of pens, stared out windows longer than permitted. Her notebooks were filled with half-finished thoughts, sentences that trailed off, doodles that crowded the margins. At night, she wrote letters she never sent, folding them carefully before hiding them away. She talked about leaving the school one day, not with anger, but with a kind of distant hope, as if freedom were a place she could already see but not yet reach. Another girl moved through the school like a shadow that had learned how to behave. She followed rules instinctively, not because she believed in them, but because breaking them felt exhausting. Her grades were excellent, her uniform immaculate. Teachers praised her as an example. What they did not see were the hours she spent staring at nothing, lost in thoughts she never shared. She kept a diary written in an almost painfully neat hand, lines perfectly straight, emotions carefully edited. When she smiled, it was polite and brief, as though smiling too long might reveal something she was trying to protect. The third girl watched more than she spoke. She listened to conversations without inserting herself, filing away details other people discarded. She knew which floorboards creaked, which teachers lingered too long after class, which students cried quietly in bathroom stalls. She read constantly, novels, poetry, anything that hinted at a world larger than the one contained by stone walls and strict schedules. Her friends sometimes forgot she was there until she spoke, and when she did, it was usually to say something quietly precise, something that lingered longer than louder voices ever did. Together, they formed an uneven triangle of friendship. They were close, but not identical. Their bond was built not on constant intimacy, but on recognition. Each saw something in the others that felt familiar, even comforting. They shared late-night whispers after lights out, passing thoughts back and forth like contraband. They laughed about teachers, complained about food, speculated about futures that felt impossibly far away. But beneath the surface of their friendship ran subtle tensions. Secrets were not always shared equally. There were moments when one girl fell silent while the other spoke, moments when glances lingered a fraction too long. Adolescence sharpened everything. Small slights felt enormous. Misunderstandings took root easily. None of it seemed dangerous. It felt like the ordinary turbulence of growing up. In class, they sat at different desks, lived slightly different versions of the same day. One challenged authority in small ways. An eye roll here, a question asked too sharply there. Another disappeared into academic excellence, treating achievement like armor. The third absorbed everything quietly, learning the shape of the institution without ever confronting it directly. Their dormitory room reflected this balance. One bed was always slightly messy, blankets kicked aside, books stacked haphazardly. Another was pristine, sheets smoothed to perfection each morning. The third was somewhere in between, lived in but controlled, personal items arranged with subtle intention. On the surface, it was a shared space. In truth, it was a map of three inner worlds coexisting uneasily. Letters from home arrived weekly. One girl read hers immediately, devouring every word, then rereading them late at night until the paper softened at the folds. Another waited hours, sometimes days, before opening hers, as if bracing for something unnamed. The third tucked hers away unopened, saving them for moments when the school felt especially suffocating. There were teachers who noticed things, though they never named them. A hesitation before answering a question, a sudden drop in participation, a look exchanged between two girls that seemed weighted with meaning. But the school was not a place that encouraged curiosity about inner lives. Behavior mattered more than feeling. Compliance was praised. Silence was rewarded. The girls learned quickly which parts of themselves were acceptable and which were better hidden. They adapted, each in her own way. One pushed against the edges until she was reminded where the boundaries lay. Another retreated inward, becoming smaller and more controlled. The third observed, adjusting her behavior just enough to remain unnoticed. At night, when the dormitory lights went out, the room transformed. In the darkness, rules loosened slightly. Whispered conversations stretched longer than allowed. Dreams were shared hesitantly. Fears confessed in fragments. They talked about leaving, about becoming someone else. Somewhere else. None of it felt urgent. None of it sounded like a plan. If anyone had asked, no one would describe them as unhappy. Troubled, perhaps, in the vague way adults often use when they don't want to look too closely. But they laughed. They studied. They argued and reconciled. They existed fully within the narrow world they were given. That is what made their disappearance so difficult to reconcile later. There was no single moment that clearly pointed toward catastrophe. No dramatic shift in behavior that could be held up as evidence. Looking back, people would search for signs, combing memory for meaning that had never been obvious at the time. A comment made in passing. A look held too long. A silence where there should have been a word. But in the days before they vanished, life continued with quiet persistence. They attended classes, ate meals, followed schedules. They shared knowing looks across the room, private jokes no one else understood. They went to bed believing, as most people do, that the world they woke up in would resemble the one they left behind. They could not have known that they were already being remembered differently, that soon Every small detail of their lives would be dissected, their personalities flattened into theories, that their laughter, their silence, their dreams would be reinterpreted as clues rather than simply parts of being young. Before they became absence, they were presence. Before they became a mystery, they were three girls navigating the quiet pressures of growing up within walls that demanded obedience and offered little room for uncertainty. And in those final ordinary days, nothing about them suggested that the world was about to decide they could disappear without explanation. The school did not advertise itself as cruel. It presented discipline as care, structure as safety, tradition as virtue. From the outside, it appeared almost serene, a place where chaos was kept at bay by thick stone walls and carefully preserved rituals. Parents were reassured by its age, its reputation, the sense that nothing truly bad could happen within something so established. The building itself seemed to promise endurance, as if longevity were proof of moral authority. Inside, every hour of the day was accounted for. Bells dictated movement. Schedules left little room for drift or reflection. Students learned quickly that time did not belong to them here. It was borrowed, regulated, and monitored. Even leisure was supervised, shaped into something productive. Idleness was treated as a threat, a crack through which disorder might seep. Rules were not always written down. Many of them existed as expectations, passed from older students to younger ones through cautionary whispers. You learned when to speak, when to remain silent, when to disappear into the background. Questions were tolerated only if they reinforced the system. Doubt was quietly discouraged. Teachers rarely raised their voices. Authority did not require volume here. A look, a pause, a name spoken with just the right inflection was enough to bring a student back into alignment. Punishment was rarely dramatic. More often, it arrived as withdrawal, loss of privileges, exclusion from activities, subtle reminders that belonging was conditional. Privacy was limited by design. Dormitories were shared, letters could be inspected, personal items subject to search if deemed necessary. The justification was always the same: protection, order, the greater good. Students learned to compartmentalize, to keep certain thoughts internal, to express only what was safe. The school believed deeply in reputation. It was treated as something fragile, to be guarded at all costs. Problems were addressed quietly, internally, without unnecessary attention. Public scrutiny was viewed as more dangerous than any individual failing. Mistakes were not opportunities for growth. They were risks to be managed. This philosophy shaped how adults within the institution behaved as much as it shaped the students. Teachers deferred to administrators. Administrators deferred to tradition. Everyone deferred to the unspoken understanding that the school must remain unsullied. To challenge that was to challenge the very foundation of their professional identities. Students sensed this hierarchy instinctively. They knew which teachers might listen and which would not. They knew when a complaint would be treated as insolence rather than concern. Over time, many stopped trying to articulate discomfort at all. It was easier to adapt than to resist. There were systems in place to track behavior, though they were rarely discussed openly. Notes were kept, observations logged, patterns identified. A student who disrupted class too often, who asked the wrong kind of questions, who seemed insufficiently grateful for the opportunities provided could find herself quietly categorized. Not punished, exactly. Watched. The language used was always careful. Terms like adjustment attitude and compliance appeared frequently in internal reports. Rarely did anyone use words like fear, loneliness, or distress. Emotional complexity did not fit neatly into the school's framework, and so it was flattened into something more manageable. Corridors felt narrow even when they were not. The weight of expectation pressed in from all sides. Students learned to walk with purpose, to keep their expressions neutral. Even laughter was moderated, allowed only in appropriate contexts. Joy, like everything else, was regulated. At night, the building took on a different quality. Shadows stretched along the walls. The silence deepened, becoming almost physical. Some students found comfort in this orderliness, the predictability of it. Others felt suffocated by it, though they lacked the language to explain why. There were moments when the system revealed its cracks. A student would break, down unexpectedly. Another would act out in ways that felt disproportionate. These incidents were addressed swiftly and quietly. The goal was always restoration of order, not understanding of cause. The idea of harm was narrowly defined here. Physical injury was taken seriously, visible bruises addressed. But emotional harm was considered intangible, subjective, difficult to prove. If no one could point to a specific rule being broken, then perhaps nothing was wrong at all. This approach extended to how the school interacted with the outside world. Parents were given curated versions of reality. Reports emphasized achievements, downplayed difficulties. The school's confidence was persuasive. Many parents chose to believe it, grateful to hand over the complexities of adolescence to an institution that claimed expertise. Within this environment, students learned to survive by reading the room. Some complied fully, becoming model pupils. Others pushed gently against boundaries, testing how far they could go before being corrected. A few learned to disappear emotionally, becoming invisible in ways that felt safer. The three girls navigated this world differently, but none of them were immune to its pressures. Each carried an awareness, however faint, that the school was not simply an educational space, but a closed system with its own priorities. They felt in the way certain topics were avoided, in the way authority closed ranks when challenged. What made the school particularly effective was its ability to frame itself as benevolent. Discipline was presented as a gift, structure as love. Students who struggled were told they simply had not adjusted yet. That resistance was a phase to be outgrown. The possibility that the system itself might be flawed was never entertained. By the time the girls disappeared, the school had spent years teaching everyone inside it how to accept things without asking too much. Silence was normal. Compliance was expected. Discomfort was private. When the authorities finally stepped through the school gates, they did so with a restraint that mirrored the institution itself. There were no flashing lights, no hurried footsteps, no sense of urgency that matched the gravity of what had happened. The disappearance of 3 students was treated as a situation to be assessed, not a crisis to be confronted. From the beginning, the tone was careful, almost cautious, as though everyone involved feared disturbing something fragile. The initial questions followed a predictable pattern. Officers asked about last sightings, daily routines, recent behavior. They took notes in neat, measured handwriting. The school provided attendance records, dormitory logs, disciplinary files, documents prepared with an efficiency that suggested practice. Everything appeared orderly, too orderly. There were no signs of forced entry, no reports of screams, no broken rules that could be pointed to as obvious cause. The absence of chaos was interpreted as reassurance. If nothing appeared wrong, then perhaps nothing truly was. This assumption shaped the investigation from its earliest moments. Teachers were interviewed in quiet offices with doors closed. Their answers were polite, professional, and frustratingly vague. The girls had been normal, perhaps a little restless, perhaps a little withdrawn. Nothing alarming, nothing that would suggest imminent danger. Each response seemed designed to smooth rather than illuminate. Students were questioned in small groups, supervised closely. Many were too frightened to speak freely, their eyes darting toward authority figures as they answered. Some repeated rumors they had already heard whispered through corridors. Others said nothing at all. Silence, after all, had been reinforced as the safest response. The possibility that the girls had run away surfaced quickly. It was an easy explanation, one that required minimal disruption to the school's image. Teenagers ran away all the time, didn't they? It was framed as unfortunate, but not extraordinary. This theory was discussed more often than it was examined. No evidence supported it, but it was convenient enough to linger. Searches were conducted, but within limits. Nearby ground were checked. A few wooded areas were walked through. The effort was visible enough to be documented, but not exhaustive. The surrounding community was not alerted immediately. There were no widespread appeals, no urgent bulletins. Time passed quietly, slipping away unnoticed. Paperwork accumulated quickly. Reports were written, filed, cross-referenced. Each document created the impression of progress. Each form filled and made it easier to believe that the situation was under control. The act of documenting began to replace the act of discovering. Inconsistencies emerged almost immediately, though they were not treated as such. Timelines varied slightly depending on who was asked. One teacher recalled seeing a girl in the hallway later, then another insisted she had been in her dormitory. These discrepancies were noted, but not pursued. They were attributed to faulty memory, the unreliability of adolescence, the stress of the situation. The school's administration remained closely involved, positioning themselves as cooperative partners. Meetings were held behind closed doors. Decisions were discussed, but rarely challenged. The institution's confidence exerted a subtle influence over the investigation. It framed the boundaries of what was considered reasonable to ask. Parents were informed, but carefully. Phone calls were made with rehearsed language, emphasizing uncertainty without acknowledging alarm. They were told the girls were missing, not endangered, that there was no cause for panic, that everything possible was being done. For the families, this language offered little comfort. For the authorities, it justified a measured response. Days turned into weeks. Leads dried up almost as soon as they were identified. No credible sightings emerged. No belongings were found beyond what had been left behind in the dormitory. The absence of evidence began to feel like evidence itself, a confirmation that there was nothing more to uncover. The investigation slowed without ever formally stopping. Files were reviewed less frequently. Officers were reassigned. The case lost its urgency, absorbed into the backlog of unresolved matters that quietly accumulate in any system. What was most striking was not what happened, but what did not. There were no aggressive interrogations, no confrontations that risked discomfort. The possibility of internal wrongdoing was never seriously entertained. To suggest that something had gone wrong within the school itself would have required a different kind of investigation, one that asked difficult questions, one that challenged authority rather than deferring to it. Instead, the focus remained outward, diffuse, and ultimately ineffective. The girls were framed as having stepped outside the system, even as all available evidence suggested they had vanished within it. Over time, the language surrounding the case shifted. Missing became unaccounted for. Unaccounted for became unresolved. Each change in terminology created distance, softened the emotional weight of the situation. Words did what actions would not. They made the disappearance easier to live with. Within the school, life resumed its routines with careful determination. Teachers taught. Students studied. The empty beds were reassigned quietly. New names replaced old ones in attendance books. The physical absence of the girls was managed efficiently, but the investigation, such as it was, had already failed in its most essential task. It had mistaken order for truth, documentation for understanding. By accepting the school structure as evidence of integrity, it overlooked the possibility that the structure itself could conceal harm. Years later, when the case was revisited in fragments and footnotes, it would be described as unfortunate, complex, unsolved. Rarely would it be called inadequate. Rarely would anyone question why so little had been done when so much had been lost. The investigation did not end with a definitive conclusion. For the families, time fractured the moment the phone calls came. Each call carried the same careful phrasing, the same attempt at reassurance that rang hollow the instant it was spoken. Missing, not gone. Unaccounted for, not lost. The words were meant to steady, but they only deepened the sense that something essential was being withheld. Parents listened, nodded, thanked the caller, and then sat in silence, staring at walls that suddenly felt unfamiliar. In the early days, hope was urgent and exhausting. Mothers and fathers replayed their last conversations with their daughters, searching for meaning hidden between ordinary sentences. Did she sound tired? Was she distracted? Had there been a hesitation, a pause that now felt heavy with implication? Every memory became suspect. Every moment re-examined under a harsh, unforgiving light. Suitcases remained half-packed in bedrooms at home, untouched since the girls had left for school. Favorite sweaters still smelled faintly of them. Posters on walls faded slowly in sunlight. These physical remnants became anchors, proof that their daughters had existed beyond a headline or a police file. The parents traveled to school whenever they were allowed. They walked through hallways that felt sterile and impersonal, guided by administrators who spoke in measured tones. They were shown dormitories, classrooms, the precise places their daughters had slept and studied. standing beside empty beds. Some parents felt a strange relief that there were no signs of violence. Others felt a deeper terror in the absence of explanation. Conversations with officials were formal and restrained. Questions were answered with practiced neutrality. Investigations were ongoing. Leads were being followed. There was nothing new to report. Parents learned quickly which questions were welcome and which caused subtle discomfort. Over time, they began to censor themselves, mirroring the same silence that had defined the school. Outside the institution, rumors flourished. Small towns have a way of filling silence with speculation. Stories spread quickly, mutating with each retelling. The girls had run away together. They had fallen in with the wrong people. They had staged a disappearance for attention. Some whispers were cruel, others bizarre, but all of them shifted responsibility away from those left behind. The parents heard these stories and felt their grief sharpen into anger. They were forced to defend their daughters against strangers who had never known them, against narratives that reduced complex lives to cautionary tales, against the suggestion that this was something the girls had chosen. As weeks turned into months, public interest waned. Journalists stopped calling. Police updates became less frequent. The world continued moving forward, indifferent to the way time had frozen for those waiting for answers. Birthdays passed without celebration. Holidays became exercises in endurance rather than joy. Hope did not vanish all at once. It eroded gradually, worn down by repetition and disappointment. Each day that ended without news made tomorrow feel heavier. Parents learned the particular cruelty of uncertainty, the way it prevents closure, the way it demands constant emotional labor without offering resolution. Some families clung to optimism with desperate intensity. They imagined reunions in vivid detail. They planned what they would say, how they would hold their daughters when they returned. Others began to prepare for a different future, one that did not include answers. Neither approach offered peace. Memorial services were discussed, then postponed, then quietly held without bodies. Candles were lit for girls who were not officially dead. Prayers were offered for safety rather than rest. The ambiguity of these rituals mirrored the ambiguity of the loss itself. Within families, the disappearance reshaped relationships. Marriages strained under the weight of shared grief expressed differently. Siblings felt forgotten, their own needs eclipsed by the absence that dominated every conversation. Homes became spaces where laughter felt inappropriate, where silence settled thick and heavy. Years passed, and the case slipped further into the background of public consciousness. For the parents, it never receded. It lived with them, adapting to new stages of life. They carried it into new jobs, new homes, new routines. It was present at every milestone their daughters never reached. Occasionally, a rumor would resurface, reigniting hope or dread. A supposed sighting. A letter claimed to be written by one of the girls. Each time, the emotional cycle repeated. Anticipation, investigation, disappointment. The repetition itself became exhausting, but stopping felt like betrayal. Some parents refused to let go of the past. They organized quietly, sharing information, pushing for renewed attention. Others withdrew, protecting themselves from further pain. There was no correct way to endure this kind of loss. Every response felt insufficient. What united them was a shared sense of having been abandoned by systems that promised protection. The school had moved on. Authorities had moved on. The world had moved on. Only they remained suspended in the moment their daughters disappeared. As decades passed, the language around the case hardened into something fixed. Cold case, unresolved, unsolved. These terms carried a finality that parents resisted. To accept them felt like conceding defeat, like agreeing that their daughters' lives could be summarized by absence. Photographs aged on mantels. Faces that once belonged to children now looked increasingly out of place in a world that expected them to have grown older. Parents aged too, carrying grief in bodies that no longer had the energy to fight as fiercely as before. Yet even after years of disappointment, a quiet vigilance remained. Phones were still answered quickly. Unknown numbers still caused hearts to race. Hope, though battered, never fully disappeared. It simply changed shape, becoming something smaller, more fragile, but stubbornly persistent. The disappearance did not end with the girls. It radiated outward, reshaping the lives of everyone who loved them. And in the long, drawn-out decay of hope, the families learned a brutal truth: that unresolved loss is not a single tragedy, but a series of small ones, repeated endlessly, without ceremony or closure. By the time a decade had passed, the disappearance no longer felt immediate to anyone who had not lived inside it. Time softened edges for the outside world, even as it sharpened them for those who remained close to the loss. What had once been a shock became a story, and what had been a story slowly turned into something less precise. Memory blurred, certainty dissolved. In its place grew something stranger and more malleable. Former students returned to boarding school for reunions, walking familiar corridors now tinged with nostalgia rather than fear. Over drinks and polite laughter, someone would eventually lower their voice and mention it. The girls, the night, the unanswered questions. Each retelling sounded slightly different. Details shifted depending on who spoke and how much time had passed. The truth became fragmented, shared in pieces that no longer quite fit together. Some insisted they had sensed something was wrong even before it happened. Others claimed complete surprise. A few spoke with confidence about secret tunnels beneath the school, passages rumored to connect old wings of the building. There were stories about forbidden relationships, about punishments that went too far, about a pact made in desperation. None of these stories could be verified. All of them felt plausible enough to survive. The longer the case remained unresolved, the more it invited invention. Gaps demanded to be filled. Silence encouraged speculation. People began to project their own fears, regrets, and curiosities onto the disappearance. The girls themselves slowly faded from view, replaced by versions of them shaped to fit whatever narrative was being told. In the surrounding community, the story took on a cautionary quality. Parents warned their children about the dangers of rebellion. Teachers referenced the incident obliquely, as an example of what could happen when rules were broken. The disappearance became a moral lesson rather than a tragedy, stripped of complexity and emotional weight. The school itself never fully acknowledged the way the case lingered in collective memory. Official histories omitted it. Anniversary materials focused on achievements, traditions, resilience. New students arrived unaware of what had happened decades earlier. Those who did hear whispers were quickly reminded that dwelling on the past was unhealthy, unproductive. Over time, the absence of information began to feel intentional, even if no one could articulate why. The school's continued success seemed to depend on selective forgetting. Silence was not just tolerated, it was cultivated. The disappearance was allowed to exist only in unofficial spaces. Conversations, rumors, half-remembered anecdotes. As years turned into decades, the case became what people referred to as a legend, not in the sense of something grand or heroic, but in the way unresolved stories acquire an aura of inevitability. It was something that had happened long ago, something no one expected to ever fully understand. Journalists occasionally revisited the story, usually when anniversaries rolled around. Articles were written with familiar phrases: baffling mystery, unanswered questions, haunting case. They recycled old information, quoted retired officials, interviewed former students whose memories had aged along with them. Each piece promised insight, but delivered little new. With each retelling, the emotional core of the story thinned. The girls' personalities were condensed into shorthand descriptions. The family's grief became a background detail. What remained was atmosphere, a sense of unease, a vague discomfort that lingered without demanding action. For some former students, the legend served a different purpose. It became a way to explain feelings they had never been able to name. The strictness of the school, the pressure to conform, the way individuality had been quietly suppressed, all of it could be retroactively linked to that night. The disappearance became symbolic, a manifestation of something darker they had sensed but never fully understood. Others rejected the legend entirely. They preferred to believe the girls had chosen to leave, that the story's unresolved nature was due to chance rather than intention. This belief allowed them to preserve a more comfortable memory of their school years. To acknowledge the possibility of deeper wrongdoing would have required a reckoning few were prepared for. As memory degraded, contradictions multiplied. One person remembered hearing shouting that night. Another insisted the building had been silent. Someone claimed the police searched the grounds thoroughly. Someone else recalled barely seeing them at all. Each memory felt real to the person holding it. Even when it conflicted with others, the truth, whatever it was, became buried beneath layers of retelling. The passage of time did not bring clarity. It brought distortion. Meanwhile, the official case files gathered dust. They were stored, archived, categorized. Occasionally, someone glanced at them more out of obligation than expectation. There was no pressure to reopen the investigation, no public demand for answers strong enough to overcome inertia. The girls' names survived in fragments, in old yearbooks, in fading photographs, in the memories of those who had once known them. But they were no longer central figures in the story. They had become symbols, abstractions, placeholders for something unresolved. The danger of legend is that it feels complete even when it is not. It offers a sense of closure without delivering truth. It allows people to move on while believing they have acknowledged what happened. By the time 40 years had passed, the disappearance had settled into this uncomfortable equilibrium. It was known but not understood, remembered but not confronted, a story told often enough to feel familiar, but never closely enough to feel threatening. And in that space between memory and myth, the truth waited, unchanged by time, obscured not by secrecy alone, but by the gradual collective decision to stop expecting answers at all. The Archivist did not arrive with intention. There was no sense of destiny in the way the work began, no moment that suggested a long-buried truth was about to surface. It started as a practical matter, the kind that rarely inspires curiosity. The school was approaching a milestone anniversary, and its administration wanted its history organized, polished, and presentable. Boxes of documents that had been stored for decades were to be cataloged, sorted, and summarized. The goal was preservation, not investigation. The Archivist was chosen precisely because they were unremarkable, quiet, methodical, accustomed to handling fragile things with care. Their professional life had been spent among dust and paper, translating disorder into systems that made sense. They believed deeply in process, in the idea that everything had a place, and that careful attention could restore coherence to even the most chaotic collections. The work took place in a basement room few people visited. The air was cool and smelled faintly of old paper and stone. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Shelves lined the walls, sagging under weight of files that had not been touched in years. Some boxes were neatly labeled. Others bore only vague descriptions written in fading ink. At first, the task was routine. Admission records, financial ledgers, staff rosters, year after year of institutional life compressed into paper. The Archivist moved slowly, making notes, flagging items that required conservation. There was satisfaction in the work, a quiet pleasure in imposing order on forgotten materials. The disappearance of the three girls did not surface immediately. When it did, it was not dramatic. A brief reference in a meeting log, a line in a disciplinary index that seemed out of place. The Archivist noticed it only because it did not fit. The date was wrong. Or rather, it overlapped with something else in a way that felt inconsistent. Curiosity, at this point, was professional rather than personal. Archivists are trained to notice anomalies, to question irregularities in records. A misplaced date suggested either an error or an omission. Both demanded clarification. The Archivist began to trace references backward, pulling files from adjacent years, comparing handwriting, checking signatures. Patterns emerged slowly, like shapes forming in fog. There were gaps where documents should have been, files that ended abruptly, pages that appeared to have been removed with care, leaving behind no obvious damage. None of this proved anything. It merely suggested that the archive was incomplete in ways that did not feel accidental. The Archivists did not rush. They documented everything meticulously, noting inconsistencies without drawing conclusions. This was not an investigation, at least not officially. It was simply good archival practice. Still, a sense of unease began to settle in, subtle but persistent. What struck the Archivist most was not what was missing, but what remained. Certain memos were preserved with surprising care. Internal correspondence written in cautious language. Minutes from meetings that discussed student welfare in abstract terms, avoiding specifics. The tone was always restrained, careful not to assign blame or express emotion. The archivist had handled sensitive materials before, records of institutional failure, of decisions made under pressure. There was a familiar quality to these documents, a recognizable attempt to control narrative through language. It was not overt deception. It was curation. As days turned into weeks, the archivist found themselves staying longer than required, drawn back to the same boxes repeatedly. They cross-referenced names, compared dates, mapped relationships between departments. Slowly, an internal chronology took shape, one that did not align neatly with the official version of events. There were moments of doubt. Perhaps this was nothing more than coincidence. Archives are imperfect by nature. Time erodes clarity. Yet the pattern persisted. Every reference to the disappearance was either vague or displaced, as if deliberately kept from coalescing into a single, coherent account. The archivists began to understand that they were not uncovering a secret in the dramatic sense. There was no single document that declared wrongdoing, no confession waiting to be found. Instead, there was a structure of absence, a careful arrangement of fragments designed to prevent understanding. This realization brought with it a shift in perspective. The work was no longer just about preservation. It was about interpretation, about recognizing that what institutions choose to record is as telling as what they choose to omit. The archivist felt a growing sense of responsibility, though it was difficult to articulate. They were not emotionally connected to the girls. They had not known them. Yet there was a weight to the knowledge forming in the margins of the archive, a sense that these documents represented lives interrupted, questions deferred. At times, the archivist wondered whether they were overstepping. Their role was to organize, not to interrogate. But the boundary between the two began to blur. To ignore the inconsistencies would have been a decision in itself, a choice to participate in the same silence that had defined the case for decades. The archivist did not speak to colleagues about their findings. Not yet. There was a cautious instinct at play, a recognition that certain truths, once named, cannot be contained. Better to be certain, better to understand fully before disrupting the equilibrium. In the quiet of the basement, surrounded by paper and dust, the archivist felt a strange intimacy that comes from reading the private thoughts of the past. These were not just administrative records. They were traces of fear, of calculation, of decisions made with consequences that outlived their makers. What began as a routine assignment had become something else entirely. Not a quest, not a crusade, but a slow, deliberate uncovering of a story that had been deliberately flattened by time. The archivists did not yet know what the truth was, but they understood this much. The archive was not silent because nothing had happened. It was silent because it had been taught to be. The deeper the archivist moved into the records, the clearer it became that the silence surrounding the girls was not an accident of time, but the result of careful handling. Documents that should have intersected never quite did. References stopped just short of specificity. Names were replaced with initials, then with titles, then with nothing at all. It was a language designed to obscure, without ever appearing dishonest. One afternoon, buried beneath a stack of routine correspondence, the archivist found a thin folder seal with faded red strip. It bore no dramatic label, just a date range and a bureaucratic code. The seal had been broken before, then reattached with care, as if someone had wanted it to appear untouched. Inside were carbon copies of internal letters exchanged between administrators in the weeks leading up to the disappearance. The tone was restrained but unmistakably tense. Phrases repeated themselves across pages. Ongoing concern, pattern of influence, potential risk to institutional stability. The girls were never named together, but their initials appeared separately, scattered across different memos, as if keeping them apart on paper might prevent someone from noticing the connection. Each letter alone felt inconclusive. Together, they formed a rhythm. Meetings scheduled outside regular hours. Requests for discretion. Reminders that any actions taken must remain internally resolved. The archivist felt a tightening in their chest as the implications began to surface. These were not documents written after the disappearance. They were written before. The archivist cross-referenced the dates with other materials. Dormitory logs, counseling notes, incident reports marked resolved without explanation. A picture began to emerge, one built not on overt wrongdoing, but on categorization. The girls had been observed, assessed, and discussed within a framework that treated deviation as a problem to be managed. What was chilling was not the language itself, but its confidence. The writers assumed authority over the girls' inner lives without ever engaging them directly. They speculated about motives, about influence over peers, about the risk of contagion. The girls were reduced to variables in an equation meant to protect something larger than themselves. Further down the archive, the archivist uncovered disciplinary files that had never been referenced in the official investigation. They were thin, almost deliberately so. Notes written in careful, neutral language described behavior that, on the surface, seemed minor. Questioning rules, emotional withdrawal, disruptive curiosity. Each file ended the same way. Recommendation deferred, monitoring continued. The archivist began to understand that the girls had not been invisible. They had been highly visible, but only within a closed system that did not translate its concerns outward. The school had been watching them closely, documenting their differences, framing them as potential threats rather than students in need of care. One document, a summary prepared for a private administrative meeting, stopped the archivist cold. It outlined a proposed course of action meant to restore equilibrium. The language was abstract, deliberately vague, but its intent was unmistakable. It spoke of removal, of intervention beyond standard disciplinary measures, of a solution that would prevent further disruption. There was no follow-up document describing the implementation of this plan, no record of outcomes, just a gap, a silence that now felt deafening. The archivist sat back, the weight of the discovery settling slowly. This was not proof in the way people expect proof to look. There were no explicit admissions, no instructions written in plain language, but the convergence of documents told a story that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. The archivist searched for external correspondence. Anything that suggested law enforcement or child welfare agencies had been consulted prior to the disappearance. There was nothing. The decision-making process had been entirely internal, insulated from oversight, justified by the belief that the institution knew best. As the archivist continued, another unsettling pattern emerged. After the disappearance, documents referencing the girls were quietly reclassified. Files were moved to different sections, labeled under unrelated categories. Some were duplicated with altered dates. Others were summarized in ways that stripped them of context. This was not destruction. It was something more subtle and arguably more effective. Preservation without coherence. Enough information to claim transparency, but never enough to reveal the full picture. The archivist realized then that the chilling secret was not a single act, but a system of decisions made incrementally, each one defensible on its own, devastating in aggregate. No one document condemned the school. Together, they revealed a moral architecture that prioritized reputation over responsibility. There were moments when the archivist had to stop reading, to step outside the basement room and breathe. The knowledge carried an unexpected emotional weight. These were children, discussed in the language of risk management. Their complexity flattened into liabilities. Their disappearance rendered acceptable by the absence of witnesses and the presence of plausible deniability. What haunted the archivist most was how ordinary it all felt. There was no villainous flourish, no dramatic rupture, just meetings, memos, and decisions framed as necessary. The banality of it was terrifying. As the pieces aligned, the archivist understood why the truth had remained buried for so long. It did not fit the narrative people expected. There was no singular moment of horror to point to, no spectacle to condemn, only a slow, deliberate process that culminated in absence. The archivist faced a choice then, one that mirrored the choices made decades earlier by others. They could catalog these findings quietly, note the inconsistencies, and move on. Or they could disrupt the silence, knowing that doing so would invite scrutiny, resistance, and perhaps personal consequence. The documents had survived because someone at some point had believed they mattered. Now they were asking to be read fully, understood in relation to one another, allowed to speak in the only way they could. By the time the archivist closed the final folder that evening, the mystery no longer felt abstract. It felt intimate and unbearable. The girls had not vanished into myth or chance. They had been absorbed by a system that decided their disappearance was preferable to disorder. The secret was no longer chilling because it was hidden. It was chilling because it had been hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone patient enough to listen to what the silence was trying to say. Once the archivist allowed the documents to be read together rather than in isolation, the shape of what had happened became impossible to ignore. It did not arrive as a single revelation, but as a convergence, a slow tightening of meaning that left no room for comforting explanations. The truth was not hidden behind locked doors or coded confessions. It existed in plain language, softened by bureaucracy, diluted by process, and made palatable through repetition. The school had not panicked. That was the most disturbing realization. There was no evidence of chaos or desperation in the weeks leading up to the girls' disappearance. On the contrary, everything suggested calm deliberation. Meetings were scheduled methodically. Notes were circulated in advance. Concerns were framed as strategic rather than emotional. The girls were discussed the way one might discuss structural damage to a building, not as people in distress, but as problems requiring resolution. The internal language told its own story. Words like danger and harm were conspicuously absent. Instead, there were phrases such as disruption, influence, instability. The threat was not framed as something the girls might suffer, but something they might cause. The institution positioned itself as a vulnerable party, its reputation and order presented as fragile, in need of protection. What emerged was not a plan in the traditional sense, but a consensus, a shared understanding among those in authority that the usual disciplinary tools were insufficient. Detention, counseling, parental involvement. These were dismissed as ineffective or risky, too visible, too slow, too uncertain. The girls, in the eyes of the institution, had crossed an invisible threshold. They were no longer students to be guided, but variables that could not be controlled through ordinary means. The archivist could see how this conclusion had been reached incrementally, each step small enough to seem reasonable on its own. One report speculated about the girls' influence on others, suggesting that their attitudes might spread if left unchecked. Another raised concerns about liability, carefully phrased to imply future scandal rather than present responsibility. A third emphasized discretion above all else, warning that outside involvement could complicate matters irreversibly. Together, these documents revealed a chilling logic. If the girls could not be corrected quietly, they would need to be removed quietly. Not expelled, not officially. That would raise questions, invite scrutiny, create records that could be traced. The solution required something cleaner, something that would leave no procedural footprint. There was no document that described the final decision in explicit terms. That, too, was intentional. The archivist understood that systems like this rarely produce a single smoking gun. Responsibility is distributed. Language is softened. Intent is implied rather than declared. Everyone involved could later claim they had only agreed to their own small part. The absence of follow-up records was itself revealing. Plans discussed. Concerns noted. Then nothing, as if the story simply stopped. And yet the girls did not return. The silence after the meeting spoke louder than any confession could have. The archivist imagined a moment when the decision crystallized, not as a dramatic vote, but as a mutual recognition that no one objected. That consensus did not require enthusiasm. It required only acquiescence. A room full of people deciding, without saying so aloud, that certain lives were expendable in service of a greater good. What made the truth especially difficult to absorb was how it resisted traditional moral framing. There was no obvious villain, no individual whose cruelty stood out. The harm had been committed collectively, under the banner of responsibility. Each participant could tell themselves they were preventing something worse. The girls had not been punished in anger. They had been erased through policy. The archivist could see how the school's culture had made this outcome possible. Years of valuing obedience over inquiry, reputation over transparency, had laid the groundwork. When the moment came to choose between confronting internal failure or preserving external order, the choice felt almost automatic. The institution did not perceive itself as doing harm. It perceived itself as maintaining stability. The girls' humanity was abstracted away, replaced by assessments and projections. Once that transformation occurred, the rest followed with chilling ease. There were no records of resistance, no notes expressing doubt. If anyone objected, they did so silently or not at all. Silence, after all, had long been the school's most reliable tool. The Archivist felt a profound sense of vertigo reading these conclusions into the archive. This was not the kind of truth that could be neatly summarized. It did not offer satisfaction of clear motives or dramatic confrontation. It implicated not just individuals, but an entire way of thinking. The girls had not disappeared because no one cared. They had disappeared because too many people cared about the wrong things. In the end, the chilling secret was not what had been done, but how easily it had been justified, how ordinary the process looked on paper, how reasonable the language sounded when stripped of context, how a series of administrative decisions could culminate in the removal of 3 young lives from the world, without anyone ever having to say the word disappearance. The Archivist understood then why the case had resisted resolution for so long. It did not conform to the narratives people expect from tragedy. There was no violence to condemn, no single act to undo, only a system that functioned exactly as designed, protecting itself at the expense of those it claimed to serve. To confront this truth was to confront something far more uncomfortable than a mystery. It was to acknowledge that the greatest harm is often carried out not by monsters, but by institutions acting calmly, confidently, and without remorse. And once that understanding settled in, there was no way to unsee it. Once the truth began to take shape, another question followed with quiet insistence, pressing harder the longer it was ignored. How had so many people known enough to sense something was wrong, yet said nothing at all? The answer was not hidden in a single moment of cowardice or betrayal. It lived in patterns of behavior that had been normalized over years, in habits of silence that felt safer than confrontation. Those closest to the decision were not unaware of its weight. The documents revealed hesitation, careful phrasing, an acute awareness of consequence. What they did not reveal was protest. Concern was expressed, but always in abstract terms. Risk was discussed, but never moral cost. Each individual seemed to trust that responsibility rested elsewhere, dispersed across the group until it belonged to no one. Teachers who had noticed changes in the girls' behavior told themselves it was not their place to intervene beyond the classroom. Administrators assumed that higher authority would handle matters appropriately. Support staff followed instructions without context, believing that asking questions would only complicate things. Everyone relied on the same quiet reassurance. Someone else knows more than I do. This diffusion of responsibility was reinforced by hierarchy. The school structure was designed to flow upward, with decisions made behind closed doors and communicated downward only as needed. Those lower in the system learned quickly that curiosity could be misinterpreted as insubordination. Silence, on the other hand, was rewarded with stability. There were moments when speaking up might have altered the course of events. A meeting where a concern could have been named more directly. A report that could have been shared beyond internal channels. A conversation with parents that could have been honest rather than reassuring. Each of these moments passed quietly, unmarked by drama, easily forgotten. Fear played its part, though it rarely announced itself as such. Careers were at stake. Reputations carefully built over decades could be undone by association with scandal. For some, the school was not just a workplace, but an identity. To challenge it felt like self-destruction. Others were guided by a subtler motivation, loyalty. The institution had provided them with purpose, community, status. They believed in its mission, or at least in the version of it they had been taught. Admitting wrongdoing would have required re-examining that belief, a task more painful than silence. Even those who felt discomfort found ways to rationalize it. They convinced themselves the girls would be safe elsewhere, that whatever intervention had been planned was temporary, that authorities would step in if things truly cross a line. Hope became a substitute for action. Outside the immediate circle, the mechanisms of silence were just as powerful. Law enforcement accepted incomplete explanations because challenging them would have required effort and conflict. Journalists moved on when access was restricted. The community preferred ambiguity to the possibility that a respected institution had failed so profoundly. Time did the rest. As years passed, the urgency to speak diminished. Memories softened. The risk of reopening wounds felt greater than the potential benefit of truth. Silence hardened into habit. What made this collective quiet especially effective was how normal it felt. No one had to conspire. No secret meetings were required to enforce it. Each person simply followed the path of least resistance, choosing comfort over confrontation, certainty over doubt. The archivist saw this pattern clearly in the aftermath as well. Even decades later, when evidence began to surface, reactions were measured, cautious. There was acknowledgement, but little appetite for accountability. Statements emphasized regret without responsibility. Language was carefully chosen to avoid legal implication. Some who had been involved were no longer alive to answer questions. Others claimed they could not remember details. Memory, like documentation, proved selective. The passage of time offered plausible deniability, an escape from consequences. There were a few who struggled privately with what had happened. They carried guilt quietly, surfacing only in moments of solitude. But guilt unexpressed did nothing to change outcomes. It remained personal, contained, ultimately ineffective. The archivist understood then that the disappearance had not required a villain willing to act alone. It had required something far more common and far more dangerous, a group of people willing to remain silent together. Each silence reinforced the next, creating a shield stronger than any lie. This was why no one ever spoke. Because speaking would have meant dismantling the comfort of not knowing. It would have meant standing alone against an institution that promised security in exchange for compliance. It would have meant choosing uncertainty, conflict, and possible loss over the quiet safety of alignment. The girls had been removed not just by policy, but by passivity, by the absence of resistance, by the collective decision to look away. Understanding this did not make the truth easier to accept. It made it heavier, because it suggested that what happened was not an anomaly, but a possibility inherent in any system that values order above humanity. The silence that followed the disappearance was not a void. It was an active force, maintained daily by choices both large and small. And in that silence, the truth waited, patient and unspoken, until someone finally decided that the cost of knowing was no longer greater than the cost of not saying anything at all. When the truth finally emerged, it did not arrive with the force people often imagine. There were no courtroom revelations, no arrests, no moment where justice stood up and declared itself complete. Instead, it surfaced quietly, carried by documents and careful language, introduced into the world with the same restraint that had once concealed it. The delay had stripped of urgency, and time had dulled the appetite for consequences. The archivist's findings were acknowledged, but cautiously. Statements were released that spoke of historical context, of evolving standards, of regret without admission. The institution framed the revelation as a tragedy of another era, something incompatible with its present values. Responsibility was expressed collectively, abstractly, ensuring it could not be traced to any one person. For the families, the answers came too late to heal in any simple way. There was relief in finally understanding that their daughters had not vanished by chance or neglect, but that relief was entangled with deeper, more corrosive grief. Knowing what happened did not return what was lost. It only confirmed that the loss had been deliberate, sanctioned, and quietly accepted. Some parents felt vindicated, their long-held suspicions finally given form. Others felt hollow, unsure how to process a truth that arrived decades after might have mattered. Anger flared, then settled into exhaustion. There was no one left to confront directly, no system eager to be held accountable. Justice, in its traditional sense, felt unreachable. Public reaction was muted. News cycles moved quickly, attention shifting elsewhere. The story was framed as unsettling but distant, a cautionary tale rather than a call to action. People expressed sympathy, then returned to their lives. The weight of the truth was heavy, but it did not demand change. The school continued to operate. Its halls were renovated, its policies updated, its reputation largely intact. New generations passed through its doors unaware of the full history beneath their feet. Plaques were discussed, then deferred. Memory, once again, was curated. The archivist watched this unfold with mixture of resolve and quiet sorrow. They had not expected gratitude or recognition, but they had hoped for reckoning. Instead, they saw how institutions absorbed discomfort, smoothing sharp edges until even the most unsettling truths could be accommodated without disruption. The girls' names resurfaced briefly, spoken aloud in official context for the first time in years. Then they receded again, returning to the margins of public consciousness. Their stories were no longer secrets, but neither were they central. They occupied an uncomfortable middle ground, acknowledged but unresolved. What remained was not closure, but a lingering unease. The knowledge that truth, when delayed long enough, loses its power to compel. That accountability weakens as those responsible fade from view. That harm does not require malice to endure, only indifference and time. For those who listen closely, the story left behind a warning rather than an ending. It suggested that disappearance is not always a sudden act, but a gradual process. That people can be erased not by violence, but by decisions made calmly, confidently, and without scrutiny. The archivists returned the documents to their boxes, now properly cataloged, their significance noted for anyone willing to look. The archive was no longer silent, but it was still quiet. It spoke only to those who approached it with patience and attention. In the end, the truth did not restore what had been taken. It did not rewrite history or balance scales. It simply existed, undeniable and heavy, asking a question no one could answer comfortably. What does it mean to know something too late? And what responsibility remains when justice is no longer possible? The story did not close with resolution. It ended the way it had begun, with absence. But this time, the absence was understood, and that understanding lingered, unsettling and unresolved, long after the words stopped. In the years that followed, the story settled into a strange, unfinished shape. It did not conclude so much as it lingered, refusing to resolve itself into something clean or instructive. There was no final lesson everyone agreed upon, no moment where the past could be neatly folded away. Instead, the truth hovered at the edges of memory, returning unexpectedly, asking to be felt rather than understood. For those who learned what had happened, the knowledge altered how they saw familiar things. Old photographs of the school no longer looked quaint. Stone corridors seemed narrower. Traditions once praised for their discipline now carried an aftertaste of unease. People began to recognize how easily reverence can turn into obedience, how admiration for structure can soften the instinct to question. The families carried on because they had no other choice. Grief, once raw and consuming, had long since woven itself into the fabric of their lives. The truth did not undo that process. It simply changed its texture. Some parents spoke of feeling as though their mourning had been retroactively justified, as if the years spent refusing to accept simple explanations had finally been acknowledged. Others felt a deeper fracture, the realization that even truth could not bring peace. There were moments when anger resurfaced, sharp and sudden, not always directed at specific people, but at the idea that such a thing could happen quietly, politely, without resistance. The cruelty was not dramatic. It was procedural, and that made it harder to rage against. Occasionally, someone would ask whether knowing had been worth it, whether the archivist should have left the past undisturbed. The question itself revealed how uncomfortable the truth remained, as though silence were a kinder alternative to understanding, as though ignorance could still be defended as protection. But silence had never protected the girls. What haunted many people most was how familiar the conditions felt. The story did not belong solely to one school, one decade, one set of decisions. It echoed patterns seen elsewhere, in other institutions, other times. The prioritization of image over people, the faith in authority, the belief that order must be preserved at any cost. There was no easy way to sit with that realization. It implicated not just those directly involved, but anyone who had ever chosen convenience over confrontation, anyone who had trusted systems without questioning who they were built to serve. The archivist rarely spoke publicly after the findings were released. Their role had never been about attention, but privately, they carried the weight of having seen how history can be shaped by omission, how archives, often imagined as neutral repositories of truth, can instead become instruments of forgetting when no one asks the right questions. Sometimes they thought about the girls not as symbols or victims, but as they had been before everything else intervened, young, complicated, unfinished. They wondered who they might become in a world that had allowed them room to exist fully. That speculation was painful, but it felt necessary. To imagine futures that had been denied was a way of refusing to let the story end in erasure. The broader world moved on, as it always does. New scandals emerged. New tragedies claimed attention. But for some, the story lodged itself deep enough to alter how they listened when something felt wrong, how they reacted to polished statements and careful reassurances, how they weighed silence against discomfort. The ending, if it could be called that, did not offer relief. It offered awareness, a lingering, uneasy awareness that disappearance does not always announce itself with chaos, that harm can be quiet, administrative, justified by language that sounds reasonable until examined closely. The girls were gone. That truth did not change. What changed was the understanding of how and why. And with that understanding came an obligation, however difficult, to resist the kind of thinking that had made their disappearance possible. The story remained unresolved because resolution would have implied balance, and there was none. There was only the knowledge that something irreversible had occurred, and that knowing it did not make it right. It simply made it impossible to pretend otherwise. In that sense, the ending was not meant to comfort. It was meant to linger, to stay with those who heard it, quietly reshaping their sense of what institutions are capable of and what silence can cost. The school still stood. The archive still existed. The world continued to function. But beneath the surface of all of it ran an undercurrent of unease, a reminder that vigilance is not optional, that truth requires effort, and that some stories do not end so much as they ask to be remembered differently. And perhaps that was the only form of justice left. Not resolution, not punishment, but remembrance that refused to soften into myth, a haunting awareness that stayed awake, long after the lights went out, unwilling to let the quiet feel safe again.